Hi, everyone. I'm Samira Daswani, the host of the podcast, The Patient from Hell. Thank you for following us and listening in to the last many episodes. And thank you for joining us today. We actually have a pretty cool episode planned for y'all. Dr. Shetty is a radiation oncologist who has also started a business on the healthcare side, on the cancer side, which she will, I'm sure, tell you about. But the reason I'm super excited is because she's our first radiation oncologist on our podcast. So get ready. We will get into some of the technical details around radiation oncology, mostly from Dr. Shetty's perspective. So, with that, thank you for joining our podcast.
Samira, thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of your podcast.
Dr. Shetty, tell us a little bit about what made you go into radiation oncology. How
Oh,
did you end up there?
great question. When I was in college, I was a both a full-time college student as well as running a international nonprofit called SEVA. SEVA stands for Students Educating and Volunteering for Health Awareness. And part of the program was to go to India and speak with young adults about the dangers of using tobacco usage. We really wanted young adults to understand what the risks were from using these tobacco products, especially at young ages, and then the longer term side effects in terms of cancers at early ages. And when I was doing this work, I visited several of the cancer hospitals, like in Ahmedabad in Bombay, and I saw many young adults with very disfiguring surgeries. So they could undergo cancer treatment with surgery, but then once they went back to their villages and their homes, oftentimes they were not included because they could not eat comfortably in public, or they could not hold down jobs because they couldn't maintain their nutritional status. And that really made me think about what is the point of curing someone for cancer if they have no quality of life afterwards? What are some options that we could do to give individuals the choice of undergoing cancer treatments and so that they still have incredible quality of life afterwards? How do we preserve as much of the body as possible, both physically and functionally? And that's where I learned about the field of radiation oncology. And it combined my love of working with patients, but it also combined my great love of art. At one point, I wanted to be an artist and a physician, so it was a great way of combining both of my interests.
I love that answer, and I know you know this, but I don't think our audience has knows this actually because I do love art and science. I have a degree in art
Yeah,
history and bioengineering,
yeah,
and I have always needed to exercise two parts of my brain. So before we
yes,
go down too deeply down the oncology pathway, I'm
yeah.
curious how do you stay in touch with the artistic side of yourself today?
Wow, so many different answers for that. I think of art as a global spectrum. So whether it's reading, writing, journaling in terms of um, synthesizing your thoughts. I also think of it as in the other nonverbal expressions in terms of drawing, painting, um, even like sculpting. Although sculpting and or creating 3D things make me a little bit more nervous. Because it's like the creation has its own life and it can look back at you. But I do love working with my hands, whether it's like drawing or painting, especially.
Huh. What kind of painting?
So I've done everything from acrylics, watercolor, tempera, you name it. The mixed media ones are also really interesting to me because you never really know what you're going to get as a final product. And I love that creative process of you start at one point and experiment to get to the final answer.
I love
And
that so much. Keep going.
yeah,
I think
and I would also say that it's a journey, right? Like you don't know what you're going to get, but you learn to love what you get, and you learn how to fix things along the way to make it what you're looking for.
Oh, I love that so much. You are far more courageous than me. Tempera, acrylic. I've dabbled with acrylic, but I stick mostly to watercolor, partly because you can make tons of mistakes and you
so
can hide it.
so I feel the opposite. I feel watercolor is not forgiving because once you put that brush stroke down, like that's it. But I feel like for oils or acrylic, you can do wet on wet paint. So you can layer paint over, and there is a little bit of forgiveness. Oils, depending on how you lay the paint down, you could even go back a few hours later or even the next day and kind of tweak it if you needed to.
Okay, I may need to go and experiment with both acrylic and oil after this conversation. I
Come on over. We'll have our own art studio.
Okay, perfect. I'm so in. I definitely didn't expect to go down this rabbit hole, by the way, but super glad we did because one of the themes that's come across many episodes of ours
Mhm,
is the notion of creativity and how creativity shows
mhm,
up in different parts of our lives, especially when people are going through something fairly
mhm.
traumatic and fairly intense, and there's a lot of suffering in there. So I'm actually
Yeah,
pleasantly surprised that it came up in this conversation. So I'm
yeah.
really
I
pleased you shared
I
that.
look back at this and I am so grateful for the role of art in my life. I went to 5 schools between kindergarten and 12th grade. So we were constantly moving. My parents had us quite young, and they were moving for their own education or their first careers or things like that. And because there was so much change in our lives that as young children, we really didn't have any say in the matter. Going back to art always gave me a certain groundedness and calmness. Like that's something I could depend on, regardless of what school I was at or who my new classmates were. So even as a young child and young adult, that was my area of calm. Like that was my calm spot. And it's what really helped me learn how to focus, especially when I was in school and had challenges. It I could always go back to this one safe space, and help me get through whatever obstacles were in my way.
Thank you for sharing that. I love that story. I fully understand that. I have used art in my life in a similar fashion. I think for me it started probably a little bit later. Formal art education started in school back
Mm,
home in India, but I think me seeking it out has happened more in the last decade of my life and definitely happened through the cancer experience. I
mhm,
think art was my way of feeling grounded and centered,
mhm.
and honestly just taking that 5 minutes in the day to
Yeah,
do something with my hands that was not super intense, but just let me get out of my head. And
yeah,
it mattered a lot to me. And I think still does. It's just I think in those moments of suffering, I think it goes further than on a sort of regular casual day.
yeah.
So thank you for sharing that. I do have a question for you because I was a little surprised when you said that art was the reason you went into radiation oncology. In speaking to other radiation oncologists, what I've heard consistently is
Mhm,
radiation oncology combines, of course, the clinical aspect of
mhm.
care, but also really combines kind of the scientific piece of it, because it is a very you're using this giant instrument, and there's a decent amount of physics and mathematics, and there's all of this science technical aspect of radiation that shows up differently than in, say, medical oncology or in surgical oncology. So I'm kind of surprised that for you it was art and not the sort of science side of it. So I'd love for you to talk a bit about that.
I I never considered myself a scientist. I always considered myself an artist first, and I considered the technology a tool or medium of creating the art. So, for example, when we create these very technical radiation plans, I don't think of it as, wow, look at the technology I'm using. And what I think of it is, look at this beautiful piece that we're able to create, and this is the medium that we're using to create it. So when we create radiation plans, that can be up to, let's say, 1 millimeter of accuracy. Um, I think of it in those terms. How did I use this particular technology to
Hmm.
create this incredible final product?
Oh, that's beautiful. I love this. This is such a different analogy for me.
Yeah.
Uh, this is great. I think we should get into defining radiation because I think we've entered this analogy, and I think it's a gorgeous
Yeah.
analogy. But I do think our audience, some who've gone through radiation themselves, some who haven't, some who are sort of just listening in, family members of people who have gone through a cancer experience. So, if you don't mind, would you mind defining radiation
Abs-
oncology and just give
Absolutely.
us a bit of a 101 if you don't, if you can do that?
Absolutely. So when we think of the contrast between chemotherapy slash immunotherapy and then the contrast to being radiation oncology is delivering a localized treatment versus chemotherapy or immunotherapy is delivering a treatment that can impact your entire body. So, given that it's a localized treatment, when you're, let's say, for example, physically delivering the radiation treatment plan, we are defining an exact boundary of the space that will receive the radiation. The beam will go in, the beam will go out. So we know exactly the area that is receiving radiation. When we're physically doing it, we deliver the radiation with LINAC accelerators. So a patient is lying down on a table, and then the machine travels around them to deliver the beams from different angles to cover the specific target. The beams, you cannot see them, you cannot smell them. Oftentimes patients will say, but it was so fast. Did something really happen? Like I didn't feel anything. And that's just the way X-ray beams work. At a molecular level, what is happening? When a patient is undergoing radiation therapy, radiation in this setting is creating oxidative damage and or they're generating free radicals. If you could imagine, actually, Samir, you can do this with me. This is what I do with my patients often. Imagine just taking your two hands out in front of you
Mm-hmm.
and imagine crisscross bars between your arms.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine a little bubble that comes in between your hands and pops those little bridges apart. So what I'm trying to show you as an analogy is the DNA strands of the cancer are your two arms, and those little cross bridges are the DNA interlinks. Radiation works by creating a free radical that will come in and separate those strands. When cancer cells are growing, they are replicating so fast, they don't necessarily have time to communicate, oops, I'm damaged, oops, I need to be fixed.
Hmm.
So when the radiation creates that free radical, that bubble that separates them, that cancer cell does not know how to repair itself. And so it tags that cell to say, this is damaged. We can't repair it. Please just break it down, recycle it, destroy it. Versus a normal healthy cell is going in a more ordered or regulated process. So even if it was damaged by that free radical, it has the slow down mechanisms to say, oh, I see that my cell and my DNA is damaged. Let's repair it. Let's fix it. And so that's why when a cell is receiving radiation, it's tagged for damage or destroyed versus a healthy cell will say, this one is damaged, but we can repair it. And that's why you can see healthy cells that are perhaps in the same area where you receive radiation damage, but they can be healed afterwards versus the cancer cells that would die when receiving radiation.
Thank you. Can I ask you one sort of
Yeah,
maybe subset of a question? So there are,
absolutely.
and I'm sure you definitely know this, but my question may be misguided, by the way, so please correct my question.
No, there's no wrong questions.
So there
Oh,
are some patients that have certain mutations where the
yes,
mutation is actually like the mutation is in the DNA repair gene.
yes,
I want to say
yeah,
it's the P53 universe, but maybe
yeah.
I'm wrong about this. Is that right?
There absolutely. So there's individuals who have a variety of genetic conditions where their body will react to radiation damage differently, meaning their bodies are not able to repair certain mutations as easily or repair certain damage as easily. So for those individuals, we do have to be very careful about giving radiation specifically because we have to worry about how their bodies will interact with the radiation as well.
Got it. Okay. All right. So this is actually incredibly valuable. So as a radiation oncologist, as all of
Mhm,
the science that is backing the kind of modality of radiation, but as a
mhm,
patient, you're lying there, you have this kind of invisible, odorless experience of this
mhm,
giant machine rotating over you and targeting that sort of specific area of the body that the radiation oncologist has sort of put together in terms of the boundaries and where should it be localized, etc. What other considerations do you navigate when you're deciding to include radiation treatment or not include radiation treatment? And I know it's pretty broad and it's going to be cancer specific. And
yeah.
uh, if you don't mind giving us an example, that would be great too.
Absolutely. So I think the number one I think about is the logistics for treatment, because we can create the most beautiful, ideal treatment, but if a patient cannot complete it for any reason, then we've actually done a disservice for the patient because we may have started treatment, killed the least aggressive cancer cells, and given room for the aggressive cancer cells to keep growing. So the number one thing I think of is how do I make sure that this is manageable for my patients? Um, Oftentimes, radiation is delivered Monday through Friday for several days in a row. And for certain types of cancer, it can be for several weeks, even 6, 7, 8 weeks. So, the number one thing I always emphasize to my patients is, do you have the resources, whether that's family, friends, yourselves, to physically get to and from treatment? And if not, what options could we set up to make that happen for you? Is that arranging rides for you, or in certain locations, they may have housing nearby, so you could actually just stay there for a few weeks while you're coming to treatment back and forth, just to make it more manageable. And then the second thing that I look for is, do you have the are there other things going on for someone? I've had patients where, let's say, for example, they take care of young children, their grandchildren, or so forth, and they've said, I can't undergo this treatment because of exposure risks or things like that. So we always try to factor in those type of big picture things to make sure that it's feasible for patients.
That's supremely helpful. I absolutely know from personal experience that was
Mhm,
a big consideration
mhm,
for my treatment too. I think in my case, I got about 4 weeks of daily
mhm.
radiation treatment. I had thankfully moved prior to treatment 20 minutes away from the hospital, but I
Yeah,
was working full time. So for me, a
yeah,
lot of the
yeah,
radiation schedule was contingent on when my workday would allow it.
yeah.
And I often had I was almost always the last patient in.
Mhm.
I would go towards the tail end of my workday. And the funny part of that was that basically meant that my schedule was actually pretty variable because I was the last
Yeah,
patient in. So
yeah,
based on like how the day went, I'd sometimes be in the waiting room for like 30 seconds and sometimes
yeah,
be there for an hour
yeah,
based on kind of what was happening that day in the clinic. But I do remember that this sounds really bizarre, but from an emotional lens, my ending radiation treatment for me was emotionally the hardest.
yeah.
And it was because I had gotten to this habit of showing up to the clinic every day.
Mm,
And I was very fortunate. I had a phenomenal rad onc. She had an excellent radiation therapist team. So I became really good friends with the people who were giving me
yeah,
radiation treatment every day. So they all knew what happened in my day. They knew my favorite music. They would
yes,
expose me to like new music. They'd be like, you like this. So we found this new song that
yes,
you should listen to.
yeah.
So I actually became really good friends with them. So when treatment ended, I remember being devastated that treatment had ended, which was bizarre because I had third-degree burns from this treatment. So, physically not great, but
Mm.
emotionally, it was actually really rough. It was not what I expected at all going into it.
So I agree 100% with you in terms of what many patients report. And actually, this is another reason that I love the field, because I always tell patients, if you're not feeling well or something's bothering you, don't worry, I'll see you tomorrow, because you're here every day and I'm here every day. So there isn't the anxiety of, what if I can't reach someone when something goes wrong? You know that you can reach someone right away, which is very different from chemo or surgery, where you may see your doctors and or your team very intermittently and not have the same level of deep relationship with them. So we often have seen our patients say, by the first week, there's a lot of anxiety of what to expect. Weeks 2 through the middle are, okay, I kind of figured this out, I'm getting my groove. And then the last week, there's a lot of anxiety of, but I'm going to graduate, I'm not going to see everyone. What if something happens? So we try to schedule patients 1 to 2 weeks out in terms of an initial follow up, just to see how they're doing. But I always have had a kind of open door policy with my patients of, if there's something really going wrong or you're bothering, just call us. And if you can't reach someone, just show up. Like, someone will see you, someone will take care of you. I don't want that to be a stress factor for you.
Dr. Shai, can you talk a little bit about decision making? Because I can tell you, just again, personal example, right?
Mhm.
Because of this relationship with my rad onc, I had a phenomenal team. I had a phenomenal medical oncologist,
Mhm.
really good surgical onc, really good rad onc, but because of the frequency and the intensity of treatment, it's kind of every single day for a defined
Mhm.
period of time that's relatively short, especially compared to say chemo or something like that, like going on for months. My relationship with my rad onc was great. Like she was a deep she was like she gave me all my like support care services. She,
Yeah.
she just became kind of this like great partner across the full experience, even though I wasn't seeing her very often.
Mhm.
I do know that when it came to decision making, for me personally, it was a little difficult because the medical oncologist was sort of my quarterback through it.
Mhm.
The radon came in at a later stage in the decision making process for me. So I actually had made up my mind that I did not want to do radiation. And then had this meeting with my rad onc, and she was giving me counter data that I wasn't
Yeah.
used to. But then I had this relationship with a med onc and my surgical onc. So it was just this bizarre decision making process where I didn't have a relationship with this individual to make a call on something fairly large that came
Yeah.
later in my journey, and it felt a little disconnected from
Yes.
the other treatment modalities. So I'd love for you to talk a bit about decision making when it comes to radiation oncology.
Absolutely. The best setup is to meet up front. So where I trained at University of Washington, we often had interdisciplinary clinics where fairly soon within when the patient was diagnosed, we would meet with the patient at that time to say, um, we're going to be part of your team. You have other individuals that you need to work with first. We want to give you a brief overview of why radiation is important. And then we're going to be meeting again X number of months down the line and going through this again because it's important to set the tone of like everybody is working together and having a coordinated plan, not just someone coming in or out. And oftentimes patients won't remember a lot of those details, but they will remember, I know I met somebody back then. And that feeling of the whole team is working together is very important. Now, I have had many patients come to me later on, just like you, and some of them will have very strong feelings of, I do not want to have radiation or I cannot have radiation. And I always preface it to patients as, my job is to give you information. It's your job to make choices. So I can give you information about the statistics or what could be the potential outcomes if you don't have radiation or what are the alternatives, right? And I also say to my patients, regardless of what happens and what choice you make, I'll still always be here for you. And I've had several patients where they decided not to have radiation and it was 8, 9+ months later and they decided to come back, something had happened, and they were like nervous to come back, right? And I always say, I gave you my word then. I'm here for you, regardless of what happens. So don't worry about it. Let's just get going with the plan. I think that's something really important that physicians need to incorporate into their very first meeting with patients because there's potentially so much judgment and fear in the process of trying to do what's right for yourself versus trying to do what's been told to you or offered to you. And we need to have more compassion and grace in the process.
I really appreciate you saying that. I think one, you're speaking to the premise of our entire podcast, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the whole
Yeah.
premise behind our podcast is patients really do, they are really the decision maker, and
Mhm.
the oncologist, for the most part, is giving you, the patient, information, and it is your call to
Mhm.
get smart, to get activated, to be informed, to
Mhm.
participate in that decision making process. And if you are someone who actually doesn't want to do it, yes, you can default to what your oncologist and care team is doing because they're doing it
Mhm.
for your benefit. But if
Mhm.
you, the patient, were wanting to get involved, you do need to
Mhm.
get educated in this space that is pretty technical.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate you saying what you did
Yeah.
because a lot of times, if I don't know a space and I'm trying to get smart on a space and come to an opinion on it based on my values and my
Mhm.
choices when it comes to quality of life and risk benefit analyses, sometimes oncologists do what you said, which is show up with immense grace and compassion.
Yeah.
And then sometimes they show up not like that because there are other things happening in their lives.
Yeah.
And I think the future state of being more open to patients having opinions
Mhm.
on their care, I do hope that we as a organization, but also more
Yeah.
importantly as a community, sort of help shift us in that mode where we really do have patients at the table
Yeah.
as a counter decision maker. Because I don't think that's necessarily true today.
No. So when I've taught medical students, I've told them the number one thing you can do to make this whole encounter go successfully is make sure that there's a chair or stool for yourself in the room And make sure when you sit on that stool, you are at least at eye level or possibly even lower than eye level than your patient. Because something as simple as that, as I'm sitting down and I'm making time for you, and I'm not standing by the door looking to run away, I think makes a major difference of setting the tone. And also making sure that you're sitting at eye level with your patients because you want it to be a conversation where everyone feels in control of the situation. Nobody wants to feel um, less, so to speak. And setting up that power dynamic so that a patient feels that they have control of their choices, and can comfortably say yes or no and why, is so critical to having a long-term healthy relationship with your doctors.
I really, really appreciate you saying that. We were just actually in a different episode
Yeah.
talking about exactly this, which is building relationship with your oncologist, and I say oncologist, broadly speaking,
Yep.
oncologist, is so hard sometimes because the power
Mm.
dynamic is just hugely different.
Mhm.
It's a massive difference in the power dynamic, right? And a lot of times I've had oncologists through the work we do
Yeah.
want to dumb it down for the patient because everyone talks about the first appointment where you're deer in headlights or information
Yeah.
coming at you 200 miles an hour. And
Yeah.
it's funny because I when I went into it, I sort of had a similar reaction. I was like, yeah, okay, like I really wish it was like dumbed down for me. But then 3 months later, I was like, well, no, I need the like granular
I want more details. Yeah. But that's when the follow-up appointment is important because then you've gotten to a certain point where you can understand it. One of the other things I love to do with patients is that I will say, you have all the information in your packet. That's all good. You can take that home and read it. But I physically draw out on a piece of paper for them, like, if we do this, here's an arrow by arrow what you need to look at, and a very simple chart because the value of just writing it and giving it to someone is actually a very calming act, because it means that you've thought about like someone's unique situation and you're giving one-on-one information for that person. And oftentimes I've had patients who say, uh, I I don't necessarily know all the full details of what's going on, but I know I can trust you.
yeah.
And that's good enough for right now in terms of getting to the next steps.
Yes.
And so I think that's the important thing. Like you should both trust each other in that process, and then you can get to step two, three, four.
I love that. Can you talk maybe a bit more about how important is trust building for you, appointment one, two, three with someone? Like, is that the primary goal?
Oh,
Is there a different, like, from your lens, if you were to
mm.
stack rank goals of the first or second appointment with a patient, what are the goals from your lens?
My number one goal is to build trust because if you don't have trust, it's going to be an incredible uphill journey, so to speak. And the second is to really understand where is the patient coming from and what can they navigate. For example, I had one patient who was a public speaker, and she was going through a cancer which would impact her head and neck, and she made the point that I can't have my lips swell up because this is part of my livelihood. And she didn't feel comfortable to speak to my male colleague because she felt that she was going to be judged by this. And I specifically told her, like, there is no judgment. I just need to know what's important for you so I can make it a priority for you.
Mm,
And so we specifically
mm,
created her radiation plan to avoid her lips, because it was so important for
yeah.
her. And I think that's very important to really listen to your patients to understand what are their concerns, and not make them feel embarrassed or judged or anything else like that. Because to some degree, we're only here with you in person for a certain number of days. But outside of that, you're going to go home and live your life. And average survivor is going to live 14 years after a diagnosis. So we need to make sure that we set you up for success in all those years to come.
Dr. Shayad, you just briefly touched on it, but I'd love for if you're up for it to go a little bit deeper on it, which is the role of gender when it comes to patient and oncologist, and maybe even race and ethnicity in a world where DEI is everywhere today.
Yeah.
Finally, I'd love for you to touch on that, both from the oncologist lens, maybe your personal lens, and then how it shows up in that appointment room?
Oh, there's so many ways. I want to say the average oncologist, or the general distribution is about 30% are women, 70% are male. I do see that as a very different experience in terms of the both the patient and the physician perspective. In terms of the dynamics, I do tend to find more women want to have me as their doctor because they just feel more comfortable having a woman doctor, especially if you're exposing, for example, your more private parts. It's just something, especially in certain cultures, that is just not allowed really. So I do feel that I'm grateful there are more women in medicine so that we can be respectful of patients' wishes from that standpoint. I've also interestingly had several male patients transfer their care over to me because they say, "Well, women are better listeners," or a variety of things. And I say, "Well, men and women are great listeners, and non-binary people are great listeners too. It's what you feel comfortable with. But certainly, if I can help you, I'm happy to in any way." And so I think it's looking at that range. Now, I've had some patients, one of my very dear patients who came in, who was non-binary, who had long nails and earrings and a beard, and came in, I walked into the room and I said, "Oh, I'm Dr. Shetty. What would you like me to call you by?"
Mm.
And I didn't realize this until several weeks later, and he told me later on that he was very scared by that question.
Huh.
And I thought, "Oh, I didn't mean it to be scary." And again, we had a really good relationship, so he was able to tell me this, but he was very nervous about how I might judge him based on what he responded by.
Mm. Mm.
And he taught me so much about just being open to who you are, what you can do, and humility in caring for patients. But throughout the experience, I think one of the things I remember from that first appointment is just reaching out and like holding his hands. I said, "Oh, your nails are gorgeous. Like, how do you keep them in such great shape?" And so at that moment, he knew I wasn't judging any of his choices.
Mm.
So it's these small gestures I think that can really reassure a patient, especially if they don't necessarily feel like they fit in a specific box.
I really appreciate that. This podcast has been great, by the way. I think we've opened up so many
Mm.
interrelated points of
Yeah,
view that we just, as a community, don't necessarily talk about as
yeah.
much as I really hope we did. So I'm really glad that we've gone into the sort of intricacies of relationship building, trust
Mhm,
building, diversity, both on the oncologist side, but also on the patient side.
mhm,
Um, I'd love your thoughts on how patients and family members should think about the inclusion of. I'm going back sort of in it to our
mhm,
side.
mhm.
The inclusion of radiation treatment more from a late effect, long term side effect
Yeah.
perspective. And I can share a little bit about where I'm going with this.
Okay.
Just to give you some color, and
Yeah,
of course, I'm a breast cancer survivor.
yeah,
For me, it was triple positive, so I had all modalities of care. I do remember that after radiation treatment ended, my fatigue levels were through the roof,
yeah,
and my medical oncologist kept saying, "Hey, this is radiation. This is radiation. It's not the infusion you're on. It's not a side effect profile." And I just remember being like, "Yeah, I sure," but radiation, the immediate side effects and the late effects felt so different than each other. So
yes,
I'd love for you to talk a bit about the side effect profile of this treatment that is invisible, odorless, every
yes,
single day.
yeah.
So just a bit about that would be great.
One of the things that's hugely beneficial in radiation is because patients are coming in every week, we will meet with them as a follow-up appointment once a week as well. And in the best case scenario, we're oftentimes telling patients, okay, this is where you're at right now in terms of side effects. This is what you should expect next week. So that at least there's the framework of, oh, okay, this makes sense, as opposed to, oh my gosh, I didn't even know I was supposed to have this side effect. And that pre-planning does make a big difference in terms of being able to overcome the actual symptoms or signs. what we know is radiation is a cumulative experience. So it's if you can imagine lifting weights, right? The first week you lift 10 pounds, next week 20 pounds. By the last week, you're lifting 100 pounds. It's a lot on it's a lot on your body to do, and so we often do try to explain like it, the day after you finish radiation, it's it's not as if nothing else is going on in your body. Your body is still fighting cancer cells, even though you're not showing up for your appointments. So it's same thing if you went to the gym and lifted 100 pounds. You're not going to feel bad today. You're going to feel bad tomorrow and the day afterwards when you realize, wow, I did a lot of work. And the same thing goes with radiation. So, especially for that first month afterwards, your body is doing a lot of work to kill cancer cells, which, and in that process, you're experiencing fatigue. Your body's literally using energy to kill cancer cells. For most patients, by about week 3 or 4, they start to notice, oh, I can see a subtle difference. Things are getting a little bit better in terms of getting back to my daily routine or things like that. Now, Samira, for you specifically, because you had radiation and you had other modalities of treatment, I mean, for you, it was like running a triathlon, right? So you had 3 sets of things and then a big wham at the end. And so that's where you really felt it as well. So it's a combination of the two.
Yeah, no, I'm completely with you. I remember being kind of just
Mhm.
highly amused that
Yeah,
uh, my care team's amazing, and I
yeah,
know they were not doing this. It's just for me sitting in the middle of it was kind of amusing because the radiation oncologist would be like, "Well, you're on infusions, and that's
yeah,
contributing."
yeah,
But well,
yeah,
just for the radiation, I'm like, guys,
yeah.
this is
So
just
one of the kind of classic questions or something I will see with my patients is if I start asking a question and I see a slightly glazed over look, and then I ask them, I notice a pause. Is that because you're thinking about the answer, or is that because you don't remember the first part of like the first words of the question I'm asking you? Because either one could happen right now, and it's the fatigue that causes you literally not to be able to remember things in terms of answering questions or what like. I've had patients say, well, I was on my way to the bathroom, but then I forgot why I was going to the bathroom. Was it to brush my teeth? Was it to wash my hands? I can't remember. And now I have to spend 5 minutes to think about why I was going to the bathroom. It's all of these small details in those last few weeks that really impact your quality of life. Now, the good thing is those symptoms go away. So then we move into a different category of symptoms, which is like the long term side effects of radiation. And that really depends on what body part was impacted, the total dose you received, the number of sessions that you received, and so forth. So we've seen a range. So 20, 30 years ago, the kind of symptoms people had were in some ways very different than the kind of symptoms that people who are having radiation right now will experience 10 to 20 years down the road. The technology has changed radically, but the the ability to treat smaller and smaller volumes has been a huge benefit to try to reduce some of those side effects.
hmm. I actually would love to go where you just went, which is
Mhm,
technology changed dramatically. So on
mhm,
this podcast, we've had a few medical oncologists come on and talk about the sort of fairly large shift that's happened in the
mhm.
space of medical oncology and how chemotherapy has evolved. I'd love for you to talk about kind of what the trends have been on the radiation oncology side. What have
Oh,
trends? What is something cool you're excited about coming to market? Would love your sort of take on the trends in radiation oncology.
I think one of the incredible trends that I've seen over the last 20 years is stereotactic radiosurgery. So in the past, if someone had, for example, a brain tumor, you had to go into the hospital. Surgery would, you need to literally open up the skull, stay in the hospital. You were in the ICU. There could be all kinds of complications from just the surgery itself, from anesthesia, all kinds of other things. And the shift away from that in terms of stereotactic radiosurgery is you can come in as an outpatient. You are lying down on a table for, let's say, 30 minutes, 45 minutes. You get up and you go home. And so you don't have the infection risk because there's no cutting of of the brain open. You may or may not need any kind of anesthesia because because you are comfortably able to lie down or something like that. So we are reducing these kind of risks. And the other one that's a quite psychological one, which people don't realize, is when you have surgery on your brain, oftentimes they used to shave your entire head, even though you didn't necessarily need that full amount. So imagine waking up from a surgery and you have no hair, and now it's going to take X number of months for it to grow back is a huge psychological factor. But going in for a treatment, you wake up or, from your treatment if you took a nap and you still have your hair and you go home, that is a massive psychological impact for a patient and for their family members because how you view somebody who's going through treatment is very different as well. So I'm incredibly grateful that we've had advancements in stereotactic radiosurgery to be able to give patients much more options. Now, stereotactic radiosurgery is only an option for certain type of cancers at certain type of sites. So it's not something for everybody. But for those who it is an appropriate candidate, it's an amazing option.
Okay, that's beautiful. I love that. I actually did not even know about this area until fairly recently. We had a community member who recently reached out
Mhm.
to the group asking for more details on it. So I know it was top of mind within our community. So I'm super glad that you
Yeah.
shared that.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the clock and I'm realizing that we probably need to start wrapping up. So one thing that I have learned about you that I think I always knew, but I don't think I fully appreciated the extent of it was how patient centric you have been in your oncology career. So I'd love, as a wrap up, for you to tell us what your vision is for oncology broadly. So if you look out 10 years, maybe
Mhm.
20 years, and you could have anything shift in this space, what would you want to shift, and what would that vision look
And
like for you?
okay, so if my fairy godmother were to come along and wave my wand, I would say I would love to be in a world where, quite frankly, we don't have a need for oncologists, like that no one develops cancer, period. I don't think that will ever happen just because of the nature of human DNA. And as we live longer and longer, we have changes in our genetic material, which lead us to potentially develop cancers. So, my second wish is that we were able to fine tune the treatments for the conditions that develop and that we can do more and more in terms of catching diseases at an early stage, one. Two, having creating products and or services to make it an easier process to go through cancer treatment. So really more development in the supportive care realm so that it's less uncomfortable, less painful. It's just more manageable. And so that we can prevent those long term side effects because people, again, are living for many, many years after a diagnosis. The key to me is how do we let you live with high quality of life, enable you to continue working, be part of your community, and living independently? So that's really the crux of what I would really love to see more and more. That it's oh, yes, it's kind of like, oh, I went in, I had my appendix taken out, and off I go. That's what I would like to see for the future of oncology.
I love that. Okay. So I think we're looking at, I know your answer was much more beautiful than what I'm going to say, but we're looking at a future of oncology where getting through cancer treatment is as simple as getting your appendix removed.
Yes.
I actually think that's a pretty neat summary of the future vision because getting your appendix removed is not that bad. Yeah, that's pretty.
No, no, you can go into you could go into certain hospital systems. You go in that morning and you're discharged that afternoon, and you're eating your dinner at home and sleeping in your bed.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great vision. I'd be down for that as opposed to
Yeah.
like months of treatment.
So I often tell patients if I had to choose between diabetes or stage one breast cancer, actually stage one breast cancer is a better option because you know what? With the stage one breast cancer, you know you have surgery, you know you have a defined treatment, you can be in and out relatively easily. This is a period of your life versus if you have lifelong diabetes and you have to change many aspects of your life for many years, it's very different experience. So let's rethink what it means to have cancer and how do we manage it compared to many other medical conditions.
I'm really glad you went there. It's actually one of the podcasts that we did that will probably release before this one is with Dr. Kogan, also from
Mm,
Stanford.
yeah.
And Dr. Manuela Kogan, we spend a decent amount of time talking about this, which is the psychological positioning of the word cancer
Mm-hmm.
vis-a-vis some of the conditions like heart disease or diabetes, right?
Mm.
Where those conditions probably have sometimes a higher mortality and definitely a higher
Yes.
morbidity impact on patient lives. But yet, that word cancer, for whatever reason, still in today's day and age where average survival is 14 years,
Mm.
has that moment of like, oh my God, my life is on the line. It just has this social, psychological impact that diabetes and cardiovascular disease just do not have. So I really appreciate you saying that because I do think that from a clinical and biological lens, what you said is completely true. And even though not stage one, but I I think intellectually knew the data behind breast cancer when I was going
Yeah.
through it, the psychological impact was not as light as diabetes. And I don't mean that
Yes.
in a bad
Yeah.
way. It actually makes me feel really bad for diabetic patients because I don't think they get the social support that sometimes
No.
cancer patients get.
No. No.
So it's this weird balance of like you might actually have a less serious disease and people are rallying around you, and then
Yeah.
the very same
You
effect
you
you
have a more manageable disease. I think that's the big thing in terms of your quality of life for years down the road.
I like that reframe. So I really like that reframe. So it's I
Yeah.
totally saw you reframe me there. I really appreciate the reframe. No, I think that's exactly right. It's about the manageability of it. So
Yeah.
thank you for that. All right, last parting thoughts. Anything you want to say?
Pick wisely. Um, Oftentimes we are inundated with so many options. So if you're going through this because you yourself have had a cancer diagnosis, or if you are the support network for family friends, advocacy is the most important thing. Education and advocacy. There are many resources out there, but making sure you get your information from uh, those who have the background to give you proper information is so important. Oftentimes, I will have patients come in who will say bring in certain products or things with the hope that this is going to cure them or make things better. And I feel terrible when I have to go through ingredients or things like that and say, actually, this could harm you in all of these ways. So they've wasted both their time and money in it, but mostly it's a loss of hope that this one thing will help them. So for example, with the company I started, Balmir, that was one of my big concerns. I want to make sure that we have products that are made safely so that we can use your time and resources as effectively as possible.
I love that. All right, that's going to be our theme for this podcast. Pick wisely.
Yeah,
Dr. Shetty, thank you so much for being a guest on our podcast and for sharing
you're
all of the knowledge you did with us today. I really appreciate the depth of both the science and the art of personal life and going through treatment and then administering radiation oncology. So thank you.
my pleasure. Thank you so much.
This podcast, show notes, and newsletter is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice, and no doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of information on this podcast or any materials linked from this blog is at the user's own risk. The content here is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice for any medical condition they may have and should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions.